It was an ordinary Tuesday afternoon at Big Bite Burger, a fast food joint in the heart of the city. The kind of place where you could expect to see a few tired office workers in suits, a couple of teenagers trying to get out of the rain, and a few families grabbing a quick bite before heading home. The smell of sizzling fries filled the air, and the sound of ketchup bottles being shaken echoed in the background. The greasy smell of burgers cooking on the grill seemed to mix with the faint smell of the rain that had just started to fall outside. The place was busy, but not overly crowded. People sat at the worn booths or gathered in line to place their orders. The buzzing of the kitchen staff working quickly and the low hum of casual chatter from the patrons made it feel like just another day at any average fast food joint. It was the kind of place that didn't stand out, except for the fact that they had the best fries in town, or so they claimed. But today, something felt different. It wasn't loud. It wasn't chaotic. But there was an undeniable shift in the air, a change in the energy. Then, just as the bell above the door chimed to signal a new customer entering, everyone in the room seemed to look up at the same time. It wasn't the sound of the bell that had drawn their attention, though. No, it was the person who had walked in. There, standing in the entrance, was none other than Elon Musk himself. The same Elon Musk whose face graced every tech magazine, whose name was constantly popping up in the news, and whose every move seemed to be under the microscope of the media. But here he was, in a fast food restaurant, on an ordinary Tuesday, just like anyone else. At first, people didn't seem to know how to react. They paused, glancing up from their meals or their phones to see who had entered. There were no gasps, no whispers. No one made a beeline for him for a selfie or to ask for an autograph. For a brief moment, the room was still. Elon, of course, noticed this. He had grown used to the stares, the sudden recognition in the eyes of those around him. But today was different. Today, it felt like he was invisible. Or maybe he simply didn't matter to anyone in this moment. For a second, he stood there, taking it all in. The normality of it all. The noise. The clatter of trays. The crackling of the deep fryer. The simple bustle of everyday life. It was peaceful in a way. Here, in a small, nondescript burger joint, he could blend in, unnoticed. And for once, he didn't mind. Elon wasn't wearing his usual billionaire attire, no expensive suits or finely tailored jackets. No high-end shoes that clicked with authority as he walked into a room. No, today he was just another guy, dressed simply in a black t-shirt and jeans. It was almost as if he was deliberately trying to go unnoticed. And in a way, it was working. People glanced at him, but didn't recognize him. To them, he was just another man in a t-shirt, walking in like anyone else. He didn't want attention. He wasn't there to make a scene. If anything, he just wanted to eat his meal in peace, away from the crowds and the constant noise of the outside world. Maybe he was craving something simple, a burger and fries, like everyone else. Or maybe he was looking for something more, something less tangible, something harder to put into words. He had everything: money, fame, a future that could change the world, but none of it ever seemed enough to fill the emptiness that sometimes crept in when he least expected it. As Elon stood by the counter, glancing over the menu above the cashier's head, a few people took notice of him. But it was a fleeting glance. Just a momentary acknowledgement of his presence before they returned to whatever they were doing. The group of teenagers in the corner kept laughing and joking with each other. The couple in the booth by the window didn't even seem to look up. It was almost as though Elon was just another part of the scenery. But that wasn't the case for everyone. Behind the counter, a young man named Brian, who had been working at Big Bite Burger for the past 6 months, didn't seem to care who had just walked in. To him, it didn't matter whether this was a celebrity or just some guy looking for a quick bite. His job was to take orders, serve food, and keep things moving. He wasn't here to get caught up in the excitement of meeting a famous face. Brian had seen his fair share of oddball customers over the months. The loud ones, the rude ones, and the ones who couldn't make up their mind about what they wanted. But Elon didn't fit any of those categories. He wasn't drawing attention to himself, he wasn't speaking loudly or trying to get anyone's attention. He was quiet, unassuming, almost as if he was trying to stay invisible. Brian glanced up briefly when Elon stepped to the counter. The briefest of glances. He could tell the man was different, maybe even famous. But Brian wasn't impressed. He had a job to do, and he had dealt with bigger crowds before. His eyes flicked back to the register. "What can I get you?" Brian asked, his voice flat and disinterested. Elon, ever the visionary, couldn't help but notice the lack of recognition. There was no fanfare, no excitement, not even the smallest trace of curiosity. In fact, it felt as if he had simply walked into a room full of people who had never seen him, who would never see him, as anything more than just another customer. It was strangely liberating. The quiet tension in the air seemed to hang around them. Elon wasn't angry, wasn't frustrated. He was simply intrigued. How long had it been since he'd been treated like an ordinary person? How long had it been since he could stand in line, waiting for his food, without someone treating him like a spectacle? He knew how it worked. People saw his name, his face, and they wanted a piece of him. They wanted to ask about rockets, about Tesla, about all the amazing things he had done and would do. But here, in this little burger joint, there were no questions. No demands. No expectations. It was a strange kind of peace. Brian, still not looking up, punched in Elon's order, "1 burger and fries, right?" he asked, sounding as if he were asking a question, but his tone made it clear he didn't really care. Elon nodded, his mind still wandering why it felt so different today. Was it the restaurant, the people, or simply the moment itself? In the corner of the room, a group of workers from a nearby office were talking loudly about the latest news. "CEOs like Musk, they just keep getting richer, right?" one of them said, laughing at the thought. "Must be nice to be that out of touch with real life." Elon didn't flinch. It was something he had heard before: comments about his wealth, his companies, his larger-than-life image. He had heard it all. But today, he felt a sense of detachment. They didn't know who he was. They didn't recognize him. And in this moment, that felt like a gift. He didn't need to prove himself. He didn't need to stand out. He was just another guy in the crowd. And that was okay. The minutes passed, the fries sizzled, and the burger cooked. Brian was still busy, his eyes glued to his register. He didn't make eye contact with Elon. He didn't offer a smile, a greeting, or even a "how's your day going?" It was all business, all routine. And Elon? He waited. He waited as if he had all the time in the world. Because in that moment, he realized something: being unnoticed didn't make him invisible. It made him human. For the first time in a long time, he was just another guy at a fast food joint, waiting for his meal. And that was strangely comforting. The meal, when it finally came, was handed to him without ceremony. The bag with his burger and fries was placed on the counter, and Brian didn't even look up to offer a thank you or "enjoy your meal." It was just part of the job. Elon took the bag, smiled faintly, and turned toward a booth by the window. He sat down, his back to the crowd. There, he took a deep breath and looked out at the rain beginning to fall. No one noticed him. And for once, that felt just right. It wasn't about the fame. It wasn't about the fortune. It wasn't about the recognition. In this moment, he was just another person, sitting down for lunch. Elon sat quietly by the window, his eyes tracing the drops of rain as they raced down the glass. The view outside was nothing special, just another rainy afternoon in the city, with people rushing by, umbrellas held above their heads, their faces blurred by the curtain of droplets. The steady patter of rain against the window seemed to mirror the calmness he felt inside. It was strange, almost like a moment frozen in time, where nothing was expected of him. As he unwrapped the burger, the smell hit him, a comforting blend of grilled meat, sizzling onions, and the familiar tang of ketchup. It wasn't gourmet by any means, but it was simple. And for someone like Elon, who had tasted the finest meals in the world, sometimes simplicity was the most satisfying. The fries, golden and crispy, were piled high in a paper container, almost as if they knew they were the star of the show. He took a handful and slowly brought them to his mouth, savoring the salty crunch. He hadn't planned to come to Big Bite Burger today. In fact, he wasn't even sure why he was here. It had been a long week, full of endless meetings, high-stakes decisions, and the usual flurry of phone calls and emails. His companies were running at full speed, constantly in the news, always under the microscope. Everyone expected him to have all the answers, to always be ahead of the curve, to push forward and never look back. But today, for the first time in a while, he felt like stepping away from all of that. It wasn't about the next big idea or the next great product launch. It was about a moment of quiet. A moment where he could sit in the background and just be. The sound of laughter broke his brief reverie. The group of office workers in the corner was still talking, their conversation loud and brash, punctuated by bursts of laughter. Elon couldn't help but overhear their words as they talked about him. "Do you think Musk really gets what it's like for regular people?" one of the workers asked, his voice mocking. "I mean, he's up there, living this life we can't even imagine. He's too busy flying to Mars to care about what happens down here." Another voice chimed in, "He's out of touch, man. People like him, they can't understand what it's like to struggle. To have to work 2 jobs just to make rent." Elon's eyes narrowed for a moment, but he didn't respond. He simply took another fry, the salty taste a welcome distraction from the bitterness creeping into his thoughts. He knew people said things like that about him. It wasn't new. The criticism was always there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting to be thrown his way. They called him out of touch. They said he didn't care about the everyday person. They accused him of being a billionaire who had lost sight of what mattered. But it wasn't true. Not in the way they thought. Elon had spent much of his life thinking about the future, about innovation, about how technology could change the world for the better. He was driven by the desire to make a difference by building things that could impact the lives of billions of people. Space travel, electric cars, renewable energy, these were the things that consumed him. And yet, despite all of it, there was always this nagging feeling, this quiet voice that asked whether it was enough. Here he was, sitting in a small fast food restaurant, and no one cared who he was. They weren't asking him for advice or telling him how to solve the world's problems. They weren't looking to him for inspiration or for answers. They were just living their lives, making their own plans, worrying about their own struggles. Elon looked at the burger again. The meat was juicy, the cheese perfectly melted, but it wasn't the taste that interested him now. It was the simplicity. The lack of pressure. The way the world outside seemed to keep turning without him having to push it. But the truth was, no matter how much he wanted to escape, the world always found a way to bring him back. He couldn't just walk away from the problems he was trying to solve. He couldn't forget about the millions of people who were depending on his companies to lead the way into the future. The rain began to pour harder outside, the droplets tapping against the window faster now, as if urging him to hurry up, to finish the burger, to leave, to get back to the grind. But he didn't rush. There was no rush today. He picked up his phone, not because he wanted to check emails or messages, but because he knew he would. His finger hovered over the screen, and for a brief moment, he considered turning it off, putting it away, and letting the world wait for once. But he knew that was impossible. The world didn't wait. Not for him, not for anyone. He opened the screen and saw several missed calls, a handful of messages, and a notification that one of his rockets had experienced an unexpected issue. His heart skipped a beat. Not today, he muttered under his breath, putting the phone face down on the table. He needed this moment. He needed to focus on something, anything, other than the whirlwind of his life. The sound of footsteps drew his attention back to the counter. Brian, the cashier, was walking toward him, a half-smile on his face. He wasn't the most talkative person, but there was something in the way he carried himself. "Everything okay?" Brian asked, his tone casual. Elon nodded, lifting the burger slightly in his hand. "Yeah, it's good. Just enjoying the moment." Brian looked at him, a little confused. "You sure? You look like you're lost in thought." Elon chuckled softly. "Maybe I am." He paused, realizing that he hadn't spoken to anyone in a while. "I've been so focused on everything else, sometimes it's nice to just sit." Brian raised an eyebrow, glancing around the restaurant. "Yeah, it's kind of quiet today. Normally, this place is packed with people trying to grab lunch during the workday. Guess you got lucky." Elon smiled, his gaze drifting toward the window again, where the rain was now coming down in sheets. "I think it's the rain," he said softly. "Makes everything seem still." Brian shrugged. "Could be. Or maybe it's just one of those days where everything slows down, and you can catch your breath." Elon looked back at the young man, sensing something in his words. There was a quiet wisdom there, something that Elon hadn't expected from a fast food worker. But sometimes, the simplest words held the most truth. "Maybe that's exactly what I need," Elon said, more to himself than to Brian. Brian didn't respond immediately. He just nodded and walked away, returning to the register to serve the next customer. Elon watched him for a moment, then returned his gaze to the storm outside. It was odd how quickly life could change. How quickly everything could go from fast-paced and overwhelming to still and quiet. As the minutes ticked by, Elon's mind wandered. He thought about the past few years. The successes. The setbacks. The criticisms. The praise. It all felt like a blur now. A never-ending race. There were times when he felt as though he was the only one pushing, the only one driving toward the future. But sitting here, in a little burger joint, he realized something: he was just a man. Just like anyone else. Just like Brian behind the counter. Just like the office workers in the corner. Everyone was running their own race, trying to figure out what mattered in their own lives. It wasn't all about changing the world, not today anyway. Today, it was about the quiet moments. The moments where nothing was expected of him. Where he could sit back, eat a burger, and just be. For once, he didn't have to be Elon Musk, the CEO, the visionary, the billionaire. He was just a guy enjoying his lunch. And that was enough. Behind the counter, Brian was fiddling with his phone, tapping through the messages with a distracted look on his face. He barely even glanced at Elon as he approached. "What can I get you?" he asked, his voice flat and uninterested. It was the kind of routine greeting that many fast food workers offered, without really thinking about it. Elon smiled softly, recognizing the indifference in Brian's tone. It wasn't the first time he had been treated like just another person in line, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. Elon could feel the weight of the day pulling at him, as he stood there, watching Brian's fingers move across the phone screen, eyes barely lifting from the device. He could understand the lack of enthusiasm, especially in a place like this. This was Big Bite Burger, not a five-star restaurant. To most people, this wasn't the kind of place where anything out of the ordinary happened. They weren't expecting anyone famous to walk through their doors. But still, there was something about it, something that bothered him just a little bit. He had been a billionaire for years now, yet the way people often treated him still had the power to unsettle him. It wasn't about the money or the fame, it was about the fact that no matter how high he climbed, how much he achieved, he was still, in so many ways, treated like just another person in the crowd. The world expected him to keep up appearances, to always be on, but moments like this made him feel small, insignificant. Brian took Elon's order without asking any follow-up questions, without offering the usual pleasantries. Just a simple "got it," and then he turned to prepare the meal, still glued to his phone. Elon shook his head, trying not to let the frustration show. He wasn't the kind of man to make a scene, not now, not ever. But the irritation was there, simmering just below the surface. He wasn't used to being ignored, and it felt like an unwelcome reminder of how out of place he sometimes felt in the world. He had spent so many years at the top of the ladder, his every move watched and analyzed by the media, by his competitors, and by everyone who had an opinion on what he should do next. And yet, here he was, completely unnoticed by the very people who were supposed to be serving him. As he stood there waiting for his order, Elon's eyes drifted toward the group sitting in the corner booth. They were a rowdy bunch, laughing loudly as they passed around their greasy bags of fries and burgers. Their conversation was punctuated by occasional bursts of laughter, but it wasn't the light-hearted chatter that caught Elon's attention. It was the content of their words. "He's getting way too big for his boots, you know," one of the men said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Acting like he's some kind of god now. Doesn't even bother to show up at his own company events anymore. I mean, come on. Who does that?" Elon's heart skipped a beat. He had heard this before. People often talked about him in this way, like he was some distant figure who had lost touch with the world. But to hear it so casually, just a few feet away from him, stung. The comment wasn't meant for him, not directly, but the words were a constant reminder of the pressure he faced every day. The idea that he had somehow become too big for everything else, the world, the people, even himself, had been something he struggled with for years. It wasn't true, but sometimes, when the weight of it all became too much, he couldn't help but feel as if the world was right. "I swear, he acts like he's the only one who's busy," another man added, taking a swig of his soda. "Like we're all just supposed to stand around and wait for his next big idea. It's ridiculous." Their voices grew louder as they continued to trash-talk the local CEO, completely unaware that the very man they were mocking was standing not 10 feet away, listening to every word. Elon could feel the heat rising in his chest. He had never been one to back down from criticism, but this was different. This was personal. They didn't know him. They didn't know the sacrifices he made, the hours he spent working tirelessly to keep his companies running. They didn't know the battles he fought, the things he had given up along the way. But here they were, laughing at him as though he were nothing more than a punchline. It wasn't just the words that hurt, it was the sheer indifference with which they spoke. It was as if his presence didn't even matter. Elon took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He could feel his hands tightening around the edges of the counter. It was one thing to be underestimated. It was another to be dismissed entirely. And that's exactly what they were doing, treating him like he was invisible. Just another person in the crowd. Just another customer at a fast food joint. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened. After all, when you're in the public eye, you become used to being talked about. People always had an opinion about him, about his choices, about his companies. He was either a genius or a madman, a visionary or a fool. There was no middle ground. He had come to terms with that a long time ago. But this felt different. It felt like a reminder that no matter how much he achieved, no matter how many lives he impacted, he would always be just another man trying to fit into a world that didn't understand him. For a moment, he wondered what it would be like to walk away from it all. To step out of the spotlight and disappear. To be just another face in the crowd, living a simple life without the weight of the world on his shoulders. He could do it. He had the resources. He could leave it all behind. No more rockets, no more electric cars, no more companies to run. He could just be. But the thought passed as quickly as it came. Elon knew better. He couldn't walk away. Not now. Not when there was still so much to be done. The world needed innovation. The world needed change. And he was the one who could make it happen. Still, as the group continued to laugh and poke fun at him, he couldn't shake the feeling of being a ghost in his own life. He had spent so long chasing success, chasing the future, that sometimes he forgot what it felt like to be seen. To be noticed for who he really was, not just for the things he had accomplished or the companies he had built. Brian came back to the counter, handing over the tray with Elon's order. "Here you go," he said, barely making eye contact. Elon took the tray without saying anything, offering a small nod. He didn't feel like speaking. Not now. Not when his mind was tangled in thoughts of everything he had done and everything he had left behind. He sat down at a corner table, his back turned toward the group of office workers. But their voices still carried across the restaurant, each word slicing through the silence like a knife. It didn't matter that they didn't know who he was. It didn't matter that Brian hadn't even looked up when he walked in. What mattered was that, for the first time in a long time, Elon was faced with the reality of what his life had become. A life of constant pressure, constant expectation, and constant scrutiny. A life where he was never truly seen, not for who he really was. He stared at the burger in front of him, no longer hungry. The tension in his chest hadn't eased. It had only grown stronger. Elon sat there for a moment longer, his mind swirling with thoughts, but he didn't get lost in them for too long. He had always been someone who worked through frustration by action, not by retreating into his thoughts. But here, in this small, crowded restaurant, he couldn't help but feel like an outsider. He had built companies that had reshaped industries, but in this moment, he was just another man, sitting at a fast food table, trying to enjoy a simple meal. It wasn't that he minded being treated like everyone else, not entirely. There were days when he wanted nothing more than to fade into the background, to disappear for just a little while. He had always believed in the idea of blending in, of walking unnoticed when possible, and living a life without the glare of public attention. The problem was, people didn't let him. It was hard to walk unnoticed when your every move, every decision, was analyzed and scrutinized. He tried to take a bite of his burger, but the food tasted bland. It was a good burger, by fast food standards, but today it felt like cardboard. The fries, which were usually the highlight, were greasy and soggy. He hadn't even realized how much time had passed until he noticed that the place had quieted down. The group of people mocking him had left, their laughter now replaced by the low hum of the restaurant's usual chatter. Brian was still behind the counter, scrolling through his phone, as if nothing had happened, as if the man sitting in the corner, Elon Musk, was just another nameless face passing through. It was odd, how accustomed people were to seeing famous faces yet failing to recognize them when they were in front of them. Some celebrities liked the attention, but Elon wasn't like that. He didn't want the constant spotlight. He wanted to be left alone to think, to create, to push the boundaries of what was possible. But no matter where he went, it seemed like that spotlight followed him. It wasn't that Elon was upset about being recognized, per se. The issue wasn't with the attention itself. The problem was more subtle than that. It was the way people only saw the surface. They didn't see the years of work, the sleepless nights, the endless challenges. They didn't see the sacrifices he had made, or the personal cost of his ambitions. He sighed, picking up a soggy fry and letting it sit in his fingers for a moment before placing it back onto his tray. No one could know what it was like to be in his shoes. They didn't understand the pressure of being a figurehead, a symbol of success and failure, all at once. No one truly understood what it took to juggle multiple companies, each demanding constant attention. No one understood the weight of being the one to always come up with the next big idea, the next innovation, the next step for humanity. But even as his frustration simmered, Elon couldn't help but admit to himself that this was the life he had chosen. No one had forced him into the spotlight. He was the one who had chosen to take on the impossible, to push for the future no matter what it cost. And yet, sitting in this dingy fast food restaurant, feeling like just another face in the crowd, there was a deep sense of dissatisfaction gnawing at him. The burger, cold and forgotten, sat in front of him as he stared out the window, trying to push the uncomfortable feeling away. He thought back to his younger days, when he first started out. Back then, things were different. He hadn't been a household name yet. He was just another entrepreneur trying to make his mark, and for a while, he had been free of the burden of fame. He could go places without being recognized, without feeling like everyone was watching him. But now, that freedom was gone. Now, his name was known around the world. His face was everywhere. And with that came expectations. Unseen burdens. His every move was dissected, his every word analyzed. He didn't just create companies, he became the embodiment of the future, a symbol of progress. It was funny, really. The people at Big Bite Burger had no idea who they were sitting near. To them, Elon was just another man waiting for his meal, blending in with the crowd. But in reality, they couldn't be farther from the truth. As the minutes passed, Elon noticed more people trickling in. They were the usual lunchtime crowd, office workers and students, people on their lunch breaks, and a few tired souls just trying to get through their day. The room was growing louder now, but Elon wasn't paying attention to the noise. His thoughts were elsewhere, lost in a sea of questions. How did he get to this point? Was it worth it? All the wealth, all the fame, was it truly fulfilling, or was it just an endless cycle of demands with no end in sight? But then, something shifted. The door opened with a slight creak, and in walked a man who had clearly been waiting for this moment all day. A tall, broad-shouldered man who strode into the restaurant like he owned the place, his presence immediately commanding attention. It wasn't his appearance alone, though. He was dressed sharply, wearing a suit that looked as though it had been tailored specifically for him. It was the way he carried himself. The man exuded confidence in a way that was impossible to ignore. Elon watched him walk to the counter, standing in front of Brian. Without skipping a beat, the man cleared his throat. "I'll have a Big Bite Burger," he said in a deep, booming voice. His words were deliberate, measured, as if he expected Brian to obey his command without hesitation. Brian didn't even look up. He simply repeated the words, "What can I get you?" still glued to his phone, as if this was just another order in a never-ending list of customers. The man stared for a moment, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. "Do you not see me standing here? I said I want a Big Bite Burger," he said again, this time with more force. His voice had a certain sharpness to it, a tone that made it clear he was used to being in charge, to people listening to him. Elon couldn't help but notice the strange interaction. The man was being ignored, just like he had been. But where Elon had accepted it, this man was clearly frustrated, his face turning red as he became more and more agitated. Finally, Brian looked up from his phone, his eyes blank. "Didn't hear you, sorry. What can I get you?" he asked, sounding completely uninterested in the situation. The man's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, there was a tense silence. Then, with a sigh, the man slammed his hand down onto the counter. "I said I want a burger. A Big Bite Burger. What is your problem?" His words were loud, and for the first time since Elon had walked into the restaurant, everyone in the room took notice. Elon looked on, his frustration momentarily forgotten. He could see the anger rising in the man's eyes, and it was clear that the situation was about to escalate. But before anything could happen, the door to the kitchen swung open, and the manager appeared. "Is there a problem here?" the manager asked, his tone calm but firm, sensing the tension in the air. The man turned toward the manager, his frustration evident. "This guy was ignoring me. I've been standing here for 5 minutes, and all he can do is stare at his phone. What kind of service is that?" Elon couldn't help but watch, intrigued by the way the man was handling the situation. The customer was becoming more aggressive, but the manager didn't flinch. "I'm sorry about that, sir," the manager said smoothly. "We'll get your order right away." But the man wasn't satisfied. "I don't want your apology. I want you to do your job," he snapped. It was clear that this man had no intention of backing down. His posture was tense, his jaw clenched, and his words came out with a certain edge, a demand for respect. Elon could feel the unease in the room as the confrontation lingered. But for a moment, Elon felt something stir within him. Something familiar. A flash of recognition. This wasn't so different from the battles he faced every day. The constant expectations, the demands, the pressure to perform. As the scene unfolded in front of him, Elon felt the anger bubbling up once more, this time not at being overlooked, but at the unfairness of it all. The injustice of it. The way the world often failed to see the people who were really working, really striving to make things happen. And here, in the middle of a fast food restaurant, he saw it once more. For a brief second, it seemed like the world was moving in slow motion. The manager was still trying to calm the situation. Brian looked helpless behind the counter, and the man stood there, his posture rigid, eyes burning with frustration. Elon finished his cold burger and stood up. This was no longer just about the meal. This was about something bigger. This was a moment that could change everything. The burger sat in front of him, greasy and cold, a reminder of what had brought him to this moment. Elon stared at it, his hand still hovering above the tray. He could feel the eyes of the room on him. The atmosphere had shifted. It wasn't just the usual hum of a fast food restaurant anymore, something more was building, something almost tangible. Elon was used to moments like this, the ones that hovered on the edge of decision, when a choice could change everything. He had lived his life constantly making decisions that pushed him into the spotlight, into places where his every move had consequences, both large and small. But this felt different. It felt personal. The argument from the nearby table was still ongoing, the man growing more animated as he shouted about the rich getting richer, how the system was broken, and how people like him could never get ahead. A few others chimed in, agreeing with him, nodding their heads as if this was the truth of the world. Elon didn't join in, but he couldn't help but hear every word, every complaint. The man didn't know it, but he was talking about him. Elon was one of the people they complained about, one of the CEOs, one of the rich people. And yet, here he was, sitting alone at a fast food table, being treated like just another customer. Elon's mind began to race. He had heard it all before, the endless complaints, the criticisms. He had been called selfish, out of touch, too focused on his companies, too distant from the needs of ordinary people. But it wasn't that simple. The world didn't see what went on behind the scenes. The sacrifices. The sleepless nights. The moments of doubt and failure. They saw only the successes, the headlines, and the shiny surface of the companies he built. But the truth was, nothing had come easy. He could feel his frustration rising, but something else was starting to emerge. This was an opportunity. An opportunity to show something different, to take a stand. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing on him. Brian had barely acknowledged him as he tossed the tray down, looking distracted as if this was just another order to fill. "Here you go, Whatever, Brian muttered, clearly uninterested. His words hung in the air like an insult, but Elon didn't react right away. Instead, he slowly picked up the burger. His fingers gripped the paper wrapping, feeling the weight of it, the coldness of it. A strange thought struck him then: what if he made a statement right here, right now? What if he could show people that not all CEOs were the same, that there was a reason behind his work, a drive to do something meaningful? What if, instead of retreating further into the shadows, he stepped up right here, in this place? He didn't have to say a word. The moment was powerful enough on its own. But there was a part of him that hesitated. This wasn't his usual way of doing things. He wasn't one to engage in petty confrontations or play the hero in front of an audience. He was more of a thinker, a visionary, someone who acted in silence. But silence didn't seem to be getting him anywhere today. Not when he was constantly overshadowed by perceptions of who he was and what he stood for. Is it really worth it? Elon asked himself quietly. He looked at the burger again, and for a split second, the sight of it made him feel nauseous. The fast food meal, the indifferent service, the people around him who would never know who he truly was, what he had accomplished, it all made him question the path he had chosen. Was it really worth all this? The fame? The wealth? The constant pressure to be something more than just a man? Just as he was about to take a bite, he noticed something. A small, subtle thing, but it caught his attention. The group of customers who had been talking loudly about CEOs and inequality had shifted. Now, they were looking at him. Their glances were brief, as if trying to figure out why the man sitting at the corner table seemed so familiar. They had no idea who he was, of course. None of them had recognized him when he walked in, and none of them had given him a second thought when he sat down. But now, they were curious. Elon saw the way their eyes lingered on him, trying to place him. He wondered how long it would take for someone to figure it out. Would one of them remember the strange way he was dressed, or the subtle hints in his demeanor? Or would they ignore it completely, continuing on with their assumptions about who he was? The waiter was still behind the counter, scrolling on his phone, unaware of anything that had transpired. The manager was talking to a different customer now, dealing with a minor issue. But there was something happening in the corner of the room, a change in the air. It was as though everything in the restaurant had shifted, just by the presence of one person who had walked in unnoticed. Elon's heart rate quickened as the idea continued to form in his mind. What if he didn't just sit here, blend in, and let this moment slip by? What if he made his presence known in a way that no one could ignore? He looked down at the burger again, still half-wrapped, and then back at the group of people who were still eyeing him. Without saying a word, he stood up. He didn't know exactly why he was doing this, but in that moment, it felt right. It was as though something inside him had snapped. "Excuse me," he said, his voice cutting through the murmur of the restaurant. The words were calm, measured, but they had a certain weight to them. The group of customers turned toward him, confused at first, but then recognizing the figure in front of them. One of them did a double take, blinking as if they were seeing a ghost. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation," Elon continued, keeping his voice steady. "About CEOs and how we get richer while others struggle. You're right about a lot of things. The system is broken in many ways. But what you don't understand is that it's not about money or power, it's about responsibility. It's about what you do with what you've got." The room fell silent as the customers stared at him. They were still trying to figure out who he was, some whispering quietly to one another. Elon could feel the eyes on him, but he didn't back down. He had made his choice. This was his moment. He went on, his tone more deliberate now. "I didn't get to where I am by being a typical CEO. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't about the power. It was about something else. It was about creating something bigger than myself. about changing the world, even if it meant facing countless obstacles and challenges. But none of you see that, do you? All you see is the money. You don't see the sacrifice, the risk, the sleepless nights. You don't see the people who actually work to make things happen, because you're too busy complaining about what's right in front of you. Elon paused for a moment, allowing the words to sink in. The group of customers sat in stunned silence, unsure of what to say. They had expected a typical response from a CEO, maybe a defensive excuse or a dismissive remark. But this was different. Elon had spoken from the heart. You think I'm one of the villains in this story, he continued, but I'm not. I'm just a man who's trying to do something bigger. And I'm sorry if that makes you uncomfortable. But instead of complaining, maybe you should think about what you're doing to make the world better. Because at the end of the day, that's all any of us can do. Try to make the world a better place, in whatever way we can. He finished speaking and turned toward the counter. The silence in the restaurant was deafening. Elon didn't stay for the response. He had made his point, and he didn't need anyone's approval. What mattered now was that he had stood up, that he had said what needed to be said. And with that, he left. Elon stepped out of the restaurant, the door swinging shut behind him with a soft clang. The air outside was crisp, the sky streaked with early evening colors that were beginning to fade into the cool blues of night. He didn't look back as he walked toward his car, a quiet sense of resolve settling within him. The confrontation, if one could even call it that, had felt like a weight lifting off his shoulders. In that small moment, inside that humble fast food restaurant, Elon Musk had said what so many never did. He had put himself out there, not as the billionaire CEO, but as a man with thoughts and ideas, a man who understood both the challenges and the rewards of striving for something bigger. His mind was still buzzing with the ripple effects of what had just transpired. He couldn't help but replay the scene over and over in his head. The stunned faces of the group. The silence that had followed his words. The way the entire restaurant had paused, as if the world itself had held its breath. But then, the questions began. Was it the right thing to do? Had he come across as arrogant? Or had he succeeded in offering a perspective that no one else would have been willing to say? As he slid into the driver's seat and started the car, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Elon glanced down at it briefly, then sighed. It wasn't unusual for his phone to be constantly ringing, vibrating, pinging with messages. The constant barrage was just part of his life now, constant reminders of everything he had to juggle, every person wanting something from him. But this time, it was different. It wasn't a business inquiry or a meeting request that popped up on the screen. No, it was something more personal, a news alert. Elon Musk seen at local fast food restaurant, public confrontation with customers goes viral. He chuckled softly, shaking his head. There it was. It had only been a few minutes, and already the moment was being twisted, packaged, and sold as the latest headline. His heart sank a little, realizing how easily the media could take something genuine and turn it into a spectacle. But he wasn't angry, not this time. He'd known what he was doing when he spoke up. He had known the consequences. Still, as he glanced at the comments beneath the article, he couldn't help but feel a twinge of discomfort. People were already dividing into camps, some defending him, some mocking him. It was typical. Some people just won't ever get it, he muttered to himself, swiping the phone screen away. He wasn't going to let it distract him. He needed to focus. There was something more important at hand now. The small seed of doubt that had been planted earlier about whether what he had done had been worth it still lingered. Was this truly the right path for him to follow, or had he simply allowed his emotions to get the better of him? As he pulled out onto the road, his thoughts shifted. Elon knew that it was moments like this, moments of tension and discomfort, that often spurred the biggest changes. But how far could this one small act go? Was it just a blip, a brief incident to be forgotten in the rush of life? Or could it ignite something more, something bigger, something that might actually make people reconsider the way they viewed the very idea of leadership, wealth, and the responsibilities that came with both? Elon had spent years trying to do exactly that, change the way people saw things. From the ambitious missions of SpaceX to the electric revolution that Tesla had ignited, his whole career had been a quest to reshape the world, to push humanity toward a future that seemed impossible. But he had always done it in the shadows, behind the scenes, through innovation and invention. Never like this, never in such a raw, vulnerable way, standing in front of ordinary people, making them question their assumptions. His mind returned to the restaurant, to the way people had looked at him after he spoke. He had seen some confusion, yes, but also something else, curiosity. Not everyone was convinced, but some had listened. Some had heard what he said. And maybe that was enough. The drive to his office felt longer than usual. Time seemed to stretch, the thoughts racing through his mind at a pace that felt out of his control. When he finally arrived at his building, Elon turned off the car, but the stillness of the moment didn't leave him. He sat there for a moment, the engine quiet now, just listening to the sounds of the world around him. There was a slight hum in the air, a buzz that seemed to echo his thoughts. The world was never static, never still. Everything moved, every decision, every action had ripples. And perhaps, just perhaps, this was one of those moments where the ripple would turn into a wave. Elon gathered his thoughts as he stepped out of the car and entered the building. His assistant greeted him with a raised eyebrow but didn't say anything. It wasn't unusual for him to show up unexpectedly after his lunch breaks, but today there was a different energy around him, an undercurrent of something more than just a normal day at the office. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of meetings, reports, and updates, but Elon's mind kept drifting back to the restaurant. The small group of people he had spoken to. The feeling of speaking up, of taking a stand when so many others remained silent. Then, just as he was wrapping up another call, a notification popped up on his screen. It was a direct message from a contact he hadn't heard from in years. Elon, I saw what you did today. It's about time someone stood up for what matters. Let's talk. I think we can do something big together. Elon stared at the message for a few moments, his mind racing once again. The name on the screen was unfamiliar, but the message? That was the kind of thing he had been waiting for. For years, he had worked tirelessly to make the world a better place, but maybe he needed to take a different approach. Maybe it was time to push the boundaries even further, to go beyond the confines of technology and space, and find a way to reach people at a deeper, more personal level. The small act, the moment at the restaurant, had ignited something. It was clear now. Elon tapped out a quick response. I'm listening. Let's meet. And just like that, another chapter began to unfold. The room remained still, the soft hum of the air conditioning the only sound cutting through the tension. For a moment, Elon stood there, his eyes locked on Brian's, watching the young cashier's face slowly shift from confusion to shock. The customers at the surrounding tables had fallen silent as well, their attention now fully on Elon. No one moved, no one spoke. It was as if the entire restaurant was holding its breath. Elon's words had hit harder than he expected. It wasn't about flaunting his wealth or status. It wasn't about proving a point to the world. But in that moment, the frustration of being ignored, being dismissed, all the times he had been treated as just another guy, bubbled up inside him. It was a reminder of the price of being someone like him, a person so used to being seen only for his title, his wealth, or his influence. He took a step closer to the counter, his posture straightening, and with a calm but firm voice, he continued, You see, Brian, it's easy to dismiss people when you don't know who they really are. But I've spent years building things that change the world. I've dedicated my life to solving problems, not for recognition, but because I believe in a better future. I think I've earned a little bit of respect, don't you? Brian's face flushed, and he finally took a step back. I didn't know, he stammered, his voice small. I didn't mean. Elon raised a hand, silencing him. It's not about knowing me. It's about understanding that everyone you encounter has a story, a life, a purpose. And how you treat people, whether they're sitting in your restaurant or sitting at a table full of investors, it matters. The room remained deathly quiet, and Brian stood frozen behind the counter, his gaze now focused on the floor, no longer looking at Elon, no longer trying to deflect the weight of the moment. The realization had fully set in. The man standing before him wasn't just someone who could be ignored. He wasn't just another rich guy walking into a fast food joint. He was someone who had built empires, someone who had the power to change lives, not just the ones of the people he worked with, but the lives of the millions who interacted with his companies. For a moment, it seemed like nothing else mattered. The customers, the food, the restaurant, it all seemed distant, irrelevant. The real issue was clear now: respect. The basic human decency of recognizing the value in others, regardless of their status. Elon took a breath and glanced around the room, his gaze sweeping over the group of people who had been gossiping earlier. The ones who had laughed about CEOs getting too rich while regular people struggled. His eyes narrowed slightly. He could feel the energy shifting. It wasn't just about Brian anymore. It was about everyone in the room, everyone who had dismissed him without knowing who he really was. Everyone who had assumed that, just because of his position, he was untouchable, unapproachable. But that wasn't the truth. Not anymore. I don't care about being better than anyone else, Elon said, his voice gaining strength as he continued. But I do care about being treated with respect. And I care about giving others the chance to earn that respect, too. It's about more than just money or power. It's about doing something that makes a difference. He paused for a moment, letting his words sink in, letting the weight of what he said resonate with the people in the room. The silence had deepened now, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that followed when something truly important was being said. People were listening. They were thinking. Brian shifted nervously behind the counter, his eyes darting between Elon and the other customers. Elon could see the young cashier trying to process everything, trying to catch up to what had just unfolded in front of him. The reality of the situation was setting in. Brian was just one part of a bigger issue, an issue of perspective, of understanding, and of treating people as equals. Let me make this simple for you, Brian, Elon continued, his tone now lighter but still carrying an undeniable edge. I'm not looking for admiration, or for people to bow down to me. But I don't think it's too much to ask for basic respect, don't you think? Brian nodded quickly, his mouth opening and closing as he tried to find the right words. I'm sorry, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know. I didn't realize who you were. I should have treated you better. Elon's lips twitched into a small smile. It's not about who I am. It's about how we treat each other. Every person in here deserves the same respect, whether they're Elon Musk or just someone grabbing a quick bite. The tension in the room started to ease, but the weight of what had been said remained. Elon turned toward the group of customers who had been making jokes earlier, and he caught a few of them looking away, avoiding his gaze. But one man, an older gentleman who had been particularly vocal about his distaste for wealthy CEOs, now looked at Elon with a mixture of curiosity and maybe even a touch of embarrassment. You know, Elon said, his voice carrying easily to their table, it's easy to sit back and point fingers at people who have more than you, but I've never met anyone who didn't struggle in some way. Success doesn't come without its own set of challenges. People make judgments based on assumptions, but we don't know the whole story. Every person has their own fight. And just because someone appears to have it all doesn't mean they don't work just as hard or harder than anyone else. There was a long, uncomfortable silence as the group exchanged glances. The man who had been speaking out the most earlier opened his mouth, but for a moment, no words came out. Instead, he simply nodded, perhaps realizing the truth in Elon's words. Elon smiled once more, though this time it was softer, more genuine. So, no more jokes, all right? Let's all just try to treat each other like human beings, no matter who we are or what we've got. With that, Elon turned on his heel and headed toward the door. But before he reached it, he stopped, pausing for just a moment. He glanced back over his shoulder, looking at the customers, at Brian behind the counter, and at the people who had witnessed the exchange. This, he said, his voice clear and resonant, this is the kind of thing that matters. Not who you know, or how much money you have, or how successful you are. It's about how we treat each other when no one's watching. Then, without waiting for a response, he stepped out of the restaurant, the door closing softly behind him. And just like that, the moment passed. But the ripple it caused would be felt for a long time. As Elon stepped outside into the cool evening air, he allowed himself a deep breath. The tension that had been building inside him for the entire day seemed to melt away, replaced by something far less tangible but no less real satisfaction. The kind of satisfaction that came from knowing he had done something important, something that could spark a change. He wasn't naive enough to think that one conversation in a fast food restaurant would solve the world's problems or that it would make people view him differently. But he knew that the seeds had been planted, and sometimes, that's all you needed. One small action, one moment where the truth was spoken, could reverberate far beyond the immediate environment. As he walked to his car, Elon's mind drifted back to what had just happened inside. The people had listened. Not just with their ears but with their hearts. They had felt the weight of his words, even if they didn't fully understand them yet. But the important thing was that they were thinking. They were reconsidering their assumptions, perhaps for the first time. And for Elon, that was a small victory. The drive back to his office was quiet, the streets dimly lit as night began to settle in. Elon's thoughts turned inward now. His career, his life, it had always been about pushing boundaries, but it had mostly been through the lens of innovation. SpaceX, Tesla, and all his other ventures were focused on changing the world, making it a better place through technology, ambition, and progress. But today, in that small restaurant, something had clicked for him. It wasn't just about the big, grand goals. It was about the human side of things, the day-to-day interactions, the respect and the understanding between people, no matter their station in life. He couldn't help but wonder if the same principles applied to his businesses. Had he been too focused on building rockets and electric cars? Had he overlooked the more subtle, human side of leadership? It was easy to get caught up in the big picture and forget about the small moments that made a real difference in people's lives. As he pulled into his parking spot and switched off the engine, Elon sat there for a moment. His phone buzzed again, and this time, he didn't even need to look at the screen to know what it was. Another news update, no doubt, echoing the viral moment at the fast food restaurant. But this time, he didn't feel a rush of annoyance or frustration. Instead, he felt oddly calm. It wasn't about the attention. It wasn't about what the world thought of him or his actions. What mattered was that he had done something real. Something meaningful. And in that small, quiet way, he had made a point that would resonate with some people. Elon got out of the car and walked into his office building, the cool, sterile air of the lobby a stark contrast to the warmth of the afternoon's events. He was greeted by his assistant, who raised an eyebrow at him. She didn't say anything, but there was a look in her eyes, one of curiosity, maybe even amusement. The news had already spread, and she had probably seen the headlines. Elon gave her a small smile and walked past her, heading straight for his office. He didn't feel like dealing with the usual flood of emails and reports just yet. Instead, he sat down at his desk, leaning back in his chair as he stared out the window. The city stretched out before him, the bright lights twinkling in the distance. It was beautiful, yes, but it also felt distant, almost detached. Like a world that he could never truly belong to. His phone buzzed again, and this time, he picked it up. It was a message from the contact who had reached out earlier. The one who had sent the message about meeting and talking about something big. Elon hadn't forgotten about it, but he had let the day unfold before making any decisions. He opened the message and began typing a response. "Let's meet tomorrow. I have some things to think about." As he hit send, Elon felt a sense of quiet anticipation. He wasn't sure what the meeting would bring, but he knew that it could lead to something meaningful. This could be the start of something bigger, something that would continue to grow, just like the small moment in the restaurant had. The truth was, Elon had never been the type to sit still for too long. He was always looking for the next challenge, the next opportunity. But after today, after the quiet confrontation in the fast food restaurant, he realized that the challenge wasn't always in the big, dramatic moves. Sometimes, it was in the small, personal moments. The quiet decisions that shifted the way people saw the world, even if it was just for a brief moment. He stood up from his desk and walked over to the window, looking out at the city once more. There was a sense of quiet satisfaction in him now, a feeling that he had said what needed to be said, and perhaps just perhaps he had done something that would have a lasting impact. The next day, as he sat in the small meeting room, facing the person who had reached out to him, Elon felt that same sense of calm. This was it. This was the beginning of something new, something different. And no matter where it would lead, he was ready. Elon stood in the center of the fast food restaurant, his gaze calm but firm, watching as Brian struggled to find the right words to apologize. The young cashier's face was drained of color, the reality of what was happening sinking in with each passing second. He stammered, trying to explain himself, but it was no use. Elon had already made up his mind. "Don't bother, Brian," Elon said, his voice soft but filled with authority. "You've had your chance to do things right, but now there are consequences." There was no anger in Elon's voice, just a quiet resolve. He had made it clear, and he wasn't going to back down. He wasn't here to create a scene or show off. He was here to teach a lesson. A lesson about respect. A lesson about the cost of arrogance. He pulled out his phone, the gesture so simple yet so powerful. As his fingers slid over the screen, he spoke calmly into the device. "Cancel the $2 million donation," he said, his voice clear and unshakable. "This will be a lesson in humility. No one is above respect, not even me." The words hit Brian like a hammer. His eyes widened, his breath catching in his throat. He tried to speak again, but his voice faltered. He wasn't sure what to say anymore. The truth of the situation was sinking in. Elon Musk wasn't just a famous CEO or a wealthy businessman. He was someone who held power, real power, over situations that others would never even comprehend. And today, that power was being wielded with cold precision. The employees who had been quietly observing the entire exchange could hardly believe what they were witnessing. Some had already heard about Elon's reputation for being a tough businessman, but seeing it firsthand was something entirely different. They had watched as Brian's casual disrespect toward the richest man in the world had backfired in the most dramatic way. And now, they were about to witness the consequences. Within moments, the atmosphere in the restaurant shifted. The familiar buzz of conversation quieted. There was a palpable sense of tension as the employees began to realize what was happening. Elon didn't flinch. He didn't shout or make a spectacle of it. Instead, he stood there, calm, his eyes never leaving Brian's, as the young cashier was surrounded by two security guards. Brian's protests were futile. The guards moved swiftly, gently but firmly guiding him toward the back door. His voice was no longer steady. He was apologizing, pleading now, but it was clear that the damage was done. Brian was being escorted out of the restaurant, fired on the spot, and there was nothing he could do about it. Elon watched as the young man disappeared from view. The restaurant had become eerily quiet, the kind of silence that felt heavy with realization. Everyone in the room had witnessed the unfolding drama, and now they had to confront what they had just seen. This wasn't just a rich man throwing his weight around for no reason. This was a message being delivered, clear and unmistakable. The employees who had once snickered behind Elon's back, who had laughed at his expense and assumed he was nothing more than an untouchable billionaire, were now processing what had just occurred. They had watched as their colleague, someone who had, just moments before, treated Elon like any other customer, was escorted out in disgrace. They saw how a single decision from Elon had flipped the entire situation on its head. They saw what real power and influence looked like, not in terms of wealth, but in terms of respect. In the wake of the confrontation, something changed in the room. The air felt different, charged with a new sense of awareness. No one dared to look down at their phones or chat amongst themselves anymore. Everyone's attention was on Elon. One of the employees, a young woman with dark hair and a nervous expression, finally spoke up. "Elon," she said, her voice tentative, I just want to say, thank you. I mean, for showing us, that we shouldn't just judge people by their status, you know? We all have to be respectful." Elon turned toward her, his expression softening. Respect is something that costs nothing, but it can be the most valuable thing you give to someone. Whether they're a billionaire or a cashier, it's the one thing that can make the world a better place. Without it, we're all just playing a game. The woman nodded, her eyes wide with understanding. The others in the room were watching, and they too were starting to grasp the meaning behind his words. They had always known that respect was important, but seeing it demonstrated in such a stark and direct way had opened their eyes to how powerful and necessary it was. One by one, the employees began to glance at each other, silently acknowledging the shift in the air. They had witnessed something transformative, and they knew they would never forget it. The respect that had been demanded by Elon had been earned in that single, quiet moment. It wasn't about fear or intimidation. It was about a deep, unspoken understanding that no one, no matter their position, was above another. Elon turned to leave the restaurant, his movements slow and deliberate. He hadn't come here for applause, and he hadn't come here to make enemies. He had come to make a point, and now that point had been made. The employees would remember the lesson of respect that had been taught today. It wasn't a lesson in how to behave toward the powerful, it was a lesson in how to treat people right, regardless of who they were. As Elon walked out of the door and into the night, he knew the world wouldn't necessarily change in an instant. But in this small restaurant, on this ordinary day, a message had been sent. A message that would ripple out and reach far beyond the confines of this fast food joint. He had spoken his truth, and in the process, had earned something far more valuable than money or influence. He had earned respect. Not because of his wealth or his status, but because he had demanded it from the people around him. And in doing so, he had shown them that they, too, had the power to demand the same. The ripple effect would be felt long after the door closed behind him. As Elon Musk walked through the door of the fast food restaurant, he couldn't help but glance back. He looked at the stunned faces of the employees standing behind the counter, still in shock from what had just unfolded. The quiet hum of the kitchen had been replaced by a stillness, a heaviness that hung in the air. It was as if the entire room had collectively exhaled and held its breath all at once. He paused for just a moment at the door, his fingers brushing the handle. Turning his head slightly, he spoke the words that would carry far beyond that small, greasy restaurant. "Remember, it's not about how much you have. It's about how much respect you give." Those words were simple, but they held a weight that would stick with everyone in that room. Elon didn't need to say anything more. The lesson had already been delivered, and it wasn't about grand speeches or dramatic declarations. It was about a quiet, calm moment in which he had shown everyone that true power wasn't in how much wealth you possessed, but in how you treated others no matter their station in life. As he stepped out into the cool evening air, Elon's words echoed in his own mind. He didn't expect them to be forgotten, not by the employees who had witnessed the whole exchange. They would remember this moment, not just because it had been shocking or unexpected, but because it had made them rethink everything they had assumed. Most people would have assumed that Elon Musk, the billionaire tech mogul, would have walked into that restaurant with an air of superiority. They would have expected him to demand attention, perhaps to make some kind of grand gesture, or to use his power to create a spectacle. But that wasn't what had happened. Instead, he had quietly, calmly, and directly taken action to teach a lesson in humility and respect. Elon had been underestimated by the young cashier, Brian. He had been dismissed, his presence unnoticed. In that moment, it wasn't the fact that he was Elon Musk, the founder of SpaceX or the CEO of Tesla, that mattered. What mattered was that he was a person just like everyone else, deserving of respect. And that respect had been given, not because of who he was or what he had accomplished, but because it was simply the right thing to do. As Elon made his way down the street, his mind started to reflect on all the moments in his life when respect had been a driving force. The rise of Tesla, the challenges of building SpaceX, the controversies he had faced in his career, these were all instances where respect had played a crucial role. But it wasn't just about earning the respect of the world's most powerful figures or even the millions of people who followed his work. It was about earning the respect of the people who mattered most, the ones who were there, day in and day out, doing their jobs, working hard, and living their lives without ever asking for recognition. For Elon, it wasn't about how many people recognized him on the street, or how many headlines he grabbed. It wasn't about how many awards he won or how much money his companies made. What mattered was how people treated each other. How respect wasn't something that was earned just because of wealth or fame, but because of the way you carried yourself, the way you treated others, and the way you carried the weight of your power without letting it corrupt you. The world was full of people who had power but didn't know how to use it. People who ruled with arrogance, demanding respect and attention without offering it in return. People who thought that their status gave them the right to dismiss those beneath them. Elon had seen it countless times in his life, the way society's richest and most powerful figures often walked with their heads held high, expecting the world to bend to their will. But what he had realized through his own experiences was that true power didn't come from expecting others to bow down to you. It came from recognizing that everyone, regardless of their job or their background, deserved the same level of respect. The cashier who handed you your food, the mechanic who fixed your car, the teacher who shaped your mind, they were all just as valuable as any billionaire or CEO. Elon's reflection on this moment, on the way he had taken control of a situation that seemed small but was so significant, gave him a sense of peace. He hadn't needed to be the loudest in the room, or to shout out commands. He hadn't needed to make a show of it. All he had needed to do was stand up for himself and demand respect, and in doing so, he had made others see the importance of doing the same. It wasn't about power, it was about showing that respect, the most basic of human courtesies, should be given freely and without condition. As he continued walking down the street, his thoughts turned toward the bigger picture. He had spent his life focusing on solving global challenges, on creating a future where humanity could survive and thrive. But today, in that fast food restaurant, he had been reminded of something fundamental. The small moments mattered. The simple actions mattered. And the way we treat each other, in every single interaction, mattered more than we could ever imagine. The employees in that restaurant would leave their shifts and go home to their families, to their lives. They would talk to their friends about what had happened, and maybe, just maybe, they would think twice before dismissing the person next to them. They might remember that everyone has a story, everyone has their struggles, and everyone deserves respect whether they were rich, poor, famous, or just a regular person working a shift at a fast food joint. Elon didn't expect the world to change overnight, but he knew that small acts of respect and kindness could start a ripple effect. The conversation would be had. People would start to question why they treated others the way they did, and whether they could do better. They would ask themselves if they had been too quick to judge, too quick to dismiss others based on their status. And in doing so, they would slowly begin to change, one small step at a time. Sometimes, the most powerful lessons didn't come from speeches or grand gestures. Sometimes, they came from simple, quiet moments of truth. They came from realizing that the people we overlook, the ones we don't pay attention to, are often the ones who can change everything. They are the ones who can teach us what truly matters: the way we treat each other, the respect we give, and the recognition that everyone, no matter who they are or what they do, deserves dignity. As Elon reached his car, he smiled quietly to himself. He knew that the lesson had been learned not just by Brian or the employees at Big Bite Burger, but by everyone who would hear the story. It was a small victory, but it was enough. Because sometimes, the most important victories aren't the ones that make headlines. They're the ones that change the way we see the world and the way we treat the people around us. And in that moment, Elon Musk knew that today had been a day well spent, not because of the headlines it might generate or the impact it would have on his business, but because he had reminded people of something that was easy to forget. That respect, true respect, was the foundation of everything. And once you understood that, you had the power to change the world, one small interaction at a time.